Hi everyone, I'm very excited to announce that I'm participating in my very first game jam in my freshly new game dev career. For those of you who don't know what a game jam is, it's basically a game development competition. There are many game jams organized by individuals or organizations of all scales, each with their own set of rules, durations that can range from a few hours to a few months. Some make you work as a team, some only allow solo developers, some allow you to reuse pre-existing code, some don't, and generally there's a jury and a winner is nominated at the end of the game jam. But I am really lucky to have joined a game jam that is organized by the community of developers around the MiniFantasy assets. There are no restrictive rules and all levels of experience are welcome. This game jam lasts 16 days and there is no jury nor winner. The theme was voted by the participants themselves and the voting was divided in 3 periods. First there was a suggestion period, secondly we would upvote any theme that interested us, and lastly the most upvoted themes were put in competition on a last vote. My own propositions had, as I expected, too much success, so we had to choose between the less popular propositions in order to make things even.
Denial.
So the theme this year is you are not the hero, you are the dungeon environment. Reminds me of another game jam theme this year. And without further ado, let's jump straight into my first day on this new project. First things first, coffee. There's no better way to start a brainstorming session. I had a vague idea of how I wanted to represent this theme in my game. Basically, I was imagining a reverse survival game where there would be a human that's trying to survive, but which is not the player. The player is Mother Nature that is trying to get rid of this human by indirectly interacting with the environment, for example by spawning predators, which would in turn attack other animals that the human is trying to hunt, for example, to starve him down. Do I have a problem with humanity? Of course, who doesn't? So I imagined the human could have multiple status bars, a hunger bar, a thirst bar, an energy bar, a temperature bar that would slowly decrease with time, and once they reach 0, his health bar would start decreasing too. Of course, I had to build a human AI that would try to keep these bars healthy. Then the player could win some points, I called them environment points, that he could use to activate some powers which will directly or indirectly affect these status bars. I started realizing I may have overscoped this, so I decided to give up on the temperature bar, which would add way too many mechanics and interactions with the other status bars. I decided on a development priority order, and I was ready and set to start developing this game. The first system to implement in this priority order is a basic human AI, and what better way to start than implementing a simple roam behavior to my human. Just to make this system explicit, every given amount of time, let's say 5 seconds, the human picks a random point around him and just heads towards this direction. I then mirrored this behavior on a basic animal, a pig to be more specific, and then I submitted my game and won the competition. Thanks for watching and don't forget to press play! Yeah, cringe, yeah. Okay, anyways, I then implemented the first status bar, which is hunger, and I also added a thirst bar in order to start building an AI that would handle decision making based on these 2 status bars levels. And finally, I added the health bar, which would start decreasing when the other status bars reach 0. As Unity's default blue background is not very appealing, I then created a very simple background level. You wouldn't put this as a priority in a development schedule, but for the sake of these devlogs and for your eye comfort, I wanted to get this done very early. So this time you won't have a full devlog episode with the default background. I mean, who would do that anyways? Of course, this is not a definitive map. The main map will be built in a much more advanced stage of development. And the very last thing I did on day 1 was to implement a very simple score calculation system to help the human take his decisions. Here, the system is extremely simple. The most valuable food source is the closest one. And as you can see, I set up a debugging system that displays the food score value on top of the animal, and this system should be useful for the rest of development. The first thing I did on day 2 was to make this food score slightly more realistic. We now have 3 different numbers displayed over an animal. As you can see, the orange score, actually you can't see because I picked the wrong color. The first orange number is a food score, which represents the absolute food amount in the food source. The second number in red is the harvest time, so that will later become a hunting time for the animals and just a harvesting time for the plants. The combination of these 2 numbers gives the final food score. So the closer an animal is and the higher his food value is, the higher the food score will be, and this will determine which food source the human heads towards when he wants to eat something. Now to fill the thirst bar, it's very straightforward. Just head towards the closest lake and drink. So everything was now set to test the human AI at its most basic behavior, which is heading towards the most efficient source to fill the lowest status bar. So right now he's heading to drink, and try guessing what happens next. As the hunger bar outruns the thirst bar, suddenly the eating action becomes priority, which makes this system absolutely not efficient. But as a consolation prize, the eating behavior is working. When he eats something, the hunger bar actually refills. So after a few hours, I managed to create a system where the human finishes an action before taking another action. I tried to make this system as scalable as possible to implement more and more actions. That's why it took me so long to set it up. I also wanted to make sure the AI that I created for the human would be completely independent from the player's actions. In order to test that, I roughly sketched one of the future player powers, where he could slay an animal by clicking on it. And I was very positively surprised to see that the human is actually adapting his actions in real time in function of what the player is doing to the environment. And seeing this, I realized this game could actually work. That encouraged me to add some simple walk and hit animations, and I also added a very handful debugging tool with which I could speed up time. You can see the timescale value at the top right of the screen. But I think right now our human, due to his diet, exclusively composed of pig meat, will die from scurvy before anything else, so I added some fruit trees to make it more diverse. I love taking care of this little human. Just a small clarification, the fruit trees refill with time, and they have different visuals to show their maturity state. Sun was setting down on day 2, and I wanted to add a last crucial addition: camera movement and zoom. This wasn't very hard to implement, except... yeah, this is not a normal behavior. The engine I'm using, Unity, is a 3D engine at its core, so I thought the camera was passing through the map while I was zooming. Except I was wrong. That can sound like a technical term, but as you can see on the right, the orthographic size I'm using to zoom and dezoom would pass to negative values when scrolling too much. I was very satisfied of my work at the end of day 2. I could press play and see this little human walk around and do his life while still being able to interact with the environment and having the human respond in real time to my actions. This was a very encouraging start, but it would not last.
If you're excited to see where this game is heading, feel free to like this video and subscribe to my channel to stay informed of episode 2's release.
I started day 3 with the will of making this UI slightly more appealing. Instead of the ugly number at the top right of the screen representing the timescale, I put some icons and some buttons to make it faster or slower, and I also added some small icons to the status bars in order to make them more explicit. This is also when I decided to add another status bar to this human, which is the energy bar. This bar has a slightly different behavior than the other bars. First of all, it depletes faster, and secondly, when it reaches 0, the objective is to make the human faint. When the human faints, the bar refills but at a very slow rate, so the human should do everything to avoid fainting. And how do you avoid fainting? Most usually by sleeping. So I worked on a small sleeping visual in order to, well, first of all make it visual, but it can also help me understand what the human is doing. At this stage the visual looks more like the human is being sucked up from his energy, but tweaking a few parameters yields something that can be understood as a human sleeping. So I can now test, except it kind of feels weird having him animated and sleeping at the same time. So I stopped the animation and made him lay down when he's sleeping. This dude really likes sleeping. I think now is a good time to explain you what my plans are to complexify the human's AI. So first of all, the human keeps track of the lowest status bar. Then there are 3 thresholds. When the lowest bar's level is above the highest threshold, the plan is to have the human loot everything around him. Because that's basically what you do when you spawn in a survival game. You start by looting everything because all your bars are going fine. Then, once the status bar goes past this first threshold, the human will start taking long-term actions in order to increase his survivability. The plan here is to add a crafting system, and the human will try crafting bandages, a fire, tent for example. And lastly, when the lowest status bar gets past the second threshold, the human will do the best action to fill this lowest status bar. There will be more specific examples examples later so you'll understand this better. In order to make this more complex AI a reality, I had to start working on looting and inventory systems. This is the first inventory system I'm building, and I think I will never do my inventory again this way. It was such a mess, and I lost so much time on this. Examples of this coming up real soon. But at this time, I was pretty happy with my inventory. It looked functional enough, and the looting system looked okay too. But I soon realized the fact that the human is able to loot an item is mostly due to luck. When I lowered the radius around an item that would trigger the item to be sucked in by the player just didn't pick up the item. So I had to add a food value to an item that was dropped on the floor. I don't know how you feel about this, but personally I find this adorable. Look at him picking up these little fruits one by one. Remember when I told you my inventory was badly set up? As you can see, the first 3 items of every type that the human picks up actually add up to 4 in the inventory. And I won't be detailing here what's happening in the code because that's very boring. Just know that I willingly ignored this bug for many days, and when I finally decided to debug it, it took me 2 hours. One of the developers in the MiniFantasy community is hosting a tournament on his game MiniQuest. It's a game inspired by Clash Royale where you can spawn troops and spells in order to get to the enemy king, and it's actually very fun to play. There could have been no better way to end the day, especially because I won both my matches. If you want to try out the game, I'll put a link in the description.
It's very simple, you can play it in your browser, just share your URL to your friend. Just keep in mind it's at a very early stage of development. And if you want to get implied further in the development of this game, feel free to join MiniQuest's Discord channel. I'll put the link in the description too.
So day 4 started with the idea of extending my loot system to any loot source, not only food sources. It took me quite a while to get things working, but I managed to get a functional system in half a day. So the first thing I did was to change my food sources into more general loot sources, and then I could start working on adding more loot sources, which of course brought its handful of bugs. For example, here, the human headed towards a cherry tree, although there are no cherries to be picked. Or this one, where he would not consider the rabbit as a loot source. By the way, yes, these 10 pixels or so are a rabbit. Or this one, where the game would crash when an item would be dropped. Or this one, where the game would crash when he picks up an item. Or this one, where the game crashes when the human picks up an item. Or this one, where the human doesn't pick up the item, even if it's 1 meter from him.
What the hell is going on?
At the beginning of this adventure, 2 months ago, I wanted to find a new activity that would first of all keep me healthy, and since I'm working alone from home, I think it's also important if I see other people. Some would have picked soccer, others basketball, so I started medieval fencing. Wait, you didn't think that was me, right? I'm fighting with foam swords. And yeah, this is way less sexy.
It was at this moment that he knew. He fucked up.
And since Roman was here to film, she also wanted to give it a try. I started day 5 by building a debug tool that would turn out to be very useful. That seems like a very good time to explain you the human AI in more detail. Basically, the human is controlled by his status bars, and each status bar has its own logic. Each bar has its set of long-term action and short-term actions. For example, the energy bar's long-term action is to try building a tent in order to recover faster from sleeping, and its short-term logic is either to head towards a tent if there's a tent already built, or to sleep if there's no tent crafted. For the hunger bar, one of the basic long-term actions is to try crafting a fire, while the short-term actions will depend on the human's inventory and of the presence of a fire or not. If there's a fire crafted and the human has raw food in its inventory, then he'll try heading to the closest fire in order to cook his food. If he has no food in his inventory, he'll try foraging first, then cooking it, and if there's no fire, either he eats the food that he has in his inventory, either he goes foraging for food. So each bar has its set of action and its logic, and what I call the human AI orchestrates these bars, activating them from time to time and making them take control of the human. Which bar gets activated depends mainly on the thresholds I mentioned earlier. I'm not sure it's the best system, but as I'm not using any specific tool to build the human AI, I had to find something to keep it organized. So back to this small debugging tool, basically I'm changing the outline color of the active bar in red. That just helps me visualize in which logic and set of actions the human is in. After setting up this debug tool, I decided to tackle this inventory problem. It took me a while to understand the source of the bug, but I figured out it was when the human picked up 3 items of the same type. It didn't add up to 3 items in the inventory, but 4. And I tried with 4 items of the same type, and it summed up to 8. So my understanding was, when you added an item in the inventory, it actually added a copy of what was already in the inventory. So on the first addition there's nothing, so that's just 1 meat, for example. Then on the second meat picked up, it adds 1 meat, which is the copy of what's in the inventory. But on the third meat picked up, as there are already 2 meats in the inventory, it adds 2 other meats. I told you it took me 2 hours to fix this bug, but it actually took me most of this day. It was extremely satisfying to fix, but I didn't want to end the day on this. It doesn't feel like you're making progress when you're debugging all day long. So my final touch on day 5 was to add this small eating animation that I personally find pretty cute and very explicit. On the evening, I wanted to go back to one of my previous games I enjoyed, and it seemed like the right time to go back to Against the Storm. If you don't know Against the Storm, it's a very interesting take on the city builder genre. It brilliantly introduces roguelike elements, which makes the game extremely replayable. When I usually play a city builder, I'll try building a beautiful town with functional logistics, but once you have a functional and pretty town, you're basically done with the game. And this is where Against the Storm shines. Games are short, and as soon as you manage to have all the logistics working, you basically finish the run. You then switch to the next town, and all of this is incorporated in a much greater gameplay loop. And for the rest, if you're interested in this game, I'll let you check out better reviews on YouTube. Just know it's a game I personally highly recommend. The only problem I have with this game, and this is my very personal opinion, others would say on the opposite side it's a huge benefit of the game, is their update release schedule. I can't keep up with the updates. There's literally one major update every 2 weeks, adding new mechanics or new buildings, for example. And when you boot up the game after a few months, like I did at the end of this day 5, I got overwhelmed by the updates, and taking into account it's a fairly complex game on the top of that, I didn't have the energy to go back to it. I think I need to take my time and integrate the new mechanics one by one in order to go back to it. It's the very first game where the update release schedule is, in my opinion, too frequent. But as I said, it's an excellent game, so definitely go check it out. On day 6, I started feeling the pain of having made a very bad coding decision. I won't go in the details, but basically my AI was bugged as hell, nothing was working, and I spent 3 full hours investigating what was happening just to fix it by adding this. And that's all. Joys of coding. The worst is, I'm 100% responsible of this bug because I didn't follow the clean code principles. Ouch. Lesson learned. Back to my crafting mechanics. I had a problem here due to the fact that every time the human looted an item, it would trigger an event that would say, okay, your action's finished, go to the next action. And this doesn't cause any problem when he's looting anything. When all the status bars are almost full, it's his basic behavior, just loot anything. But it starts causing problems when he wants to craft a specific item ordered by a specific bar. For example, the hunger bar orders the crafting of a fire, so the human will try finding wood and stones, and when he picks up a piece of wood, that triggers an action completed event, and so as I organize my AI, the AI picks another status bar, and that starts another action. So it's a really unoptimal way of making the human craft stuff. To fix this, I added a simple true or false variable, which you set to true if it's an action that is a standalone action. But if it's an action that's part of a series of actions, like for example finding items to craft something, then you set this variable to false and it will keep the same status bar active until all the items are looted. If you think that's a bad coding decision,
You're totally right. I'm going to pay this decision, and the cost is very high.
But here's an example of how it works now. Here the thirst bar is active and he needs 3 animal skins to build a bottle. So he loots 1 animal skin, and as you can see, the water bar is still active. He's still ordered to find 2 more animal skins. He hits a deer, finds another one, and the rabbit finds the third one.
It's only once he finds the ingredients for his crafting recipe that he switches to the next action.
The last thing I needed to prepare for my crafting system are crafted items. So I prepared 1 main crafting item for each status bar. A fire to cook food, a tent to sleep, a water bottle to fill and drink water, and bandages to heal. Okay, so everything was set up to start the crafting system, and at the beginning, everything worked fine. I set a limit to 1 item of each type, and for your interest, this second inventory represents the crafted items by the human. So logically, the next step was to change this limit of 1 item of each type and make it more versatile. For example, here I changed the bandages limit to 3, so that he would craft 3 bandages, and it seemed to be working well. I then fixed this very annoying bug where the human would stay stuck on the foraging animation, and with my crafting system working, the last thing to add was actual logic related to these crafted items. So I started with the bed, which seemed to be the most simple one, and the behavior is simple. If there's a bed crafted, I want the human to go back to bed to sleep. This took a few attempts to get working, but I eventually managed to implement this without too many difficulties. Next on the list, the bandages. That's a very simple system too. If the human is wounded above a certain threshold, just use a bandage and heal yourself. And to make this visual, I reused my sleeping particle system and I changed the sprite to a healing sprite. 2 more items to go. Next, the water bottle. This one started to make things more complex. I needed 2 states on my water bottle, an empty state and a fill state. I thought this would be simple, but the way I created my inventory came back smashing down my expectations. Sometimes I thought it was working, but as you can see, it actually wasn't. The logic on the thirst bar is very simple. When he goes drinking to a lake, if the human has empty bottles in his inventory, he's just going to fill them. The thing is, my script considered filled water bottles as different items as empty water bottles, so that made a mess. But in the end, I managed to get this working. As you can see here, the human has 3 filled water bottles, and he's going to drink them one by one until he has none left. Then he's going to head towards the closest water body, drink and refill his water bottles. And the last remaining mechanic related to crafted items was the fire. So first of all, I created cooked items. The cooking mechanic was surprisingly easy to implement, and I was proud of myself. But taking a step back now that I finished this game jam, I really shouldn't have. Just listen to me at the time I'm screen recording this.
Okay, let's go! End of the day! End of the day! End of the day.
Awesome! Okay, it took me like 30 minutes. I'm super proud of myself. This is a good example of my clean code power.
My sweet summer child, you really aren't prepared for what's coming.
I'm done with this game. Please make it end.